Thank you, Rob, for inviting me. Thanks for a great few days of content. I'm the Vice President of Research at the American Gaming Association for a lot of European accents over the past few days. So for those of you who aren't aware of what the AGA is or who we are the national trade group for the gaming industry here in the United States. Our members are commercial and tribal gaming operators, as well as sports books, iGaming providers, and traditional gaming suppliers. And I want to talk today a little bit about public perceptions of the industry and policymakers' perceptions of the industry. So first, a question. How many of you think that we are barreling down the same road that the industry went down in the UK here in the US? None of you. No reporters here. Nobody's on Twitter here. One person thinks we're barreling down that road. All right. I was going to say I was here to convince you otherwise, but I guess we're all on the same page already. There's a big perception out there that the industry is not paying attention to this issue and is kind of recklessly becoming what the industry looks like in the UK. And I want to tell you that's not the case here in the US. More people last year than ever before gambled in America. And at the same time, Americans have never had a more positive perception of the gaming industry. So I want to talk a little bit about overall perceptions of the industry among the public, policymaker perceptions of the industry, how the public here and how the public in the UK views our efforts on responsible gaming, and touch a little bit on the advertising issue, which I know drives a great deal of the angst around concerns with public opinion here in the US, and why I think that issue has probably plateaued and is going to kind of recede from the public mind over the relatively short term. First, as I said, more people, almost half of Americans bet one way or another last year, whether at a casino, lottery, pari-mutuel, sports betting, iGaming, what have you. Matches the high we last saw back in 2013. Something like 120 million people gambled last year in the United States. And they're gambling more across all forms of gambling. First, the lowest line here is 2021, so we do this in the summer, so maybe take that 2021 number with a grain of salt. People haven't gotten back to it yet. But you can see, again, record levels of participation, whether it's lottery, physical casino, sports betting, iGaming, VLTs, even horse racing, allegedly, if you believe the polls, has more participation than ever before. And the type of people who are visiting casinos are different than ever before. Amazingly, the average age of a past year casino visitor has fallen 8 years since before the pandemic. It was almost 50 years old was the average age of a person on the casino floor in 2019. Last year, it fell to 42. And part of that, you can see on the left, is that older patrons still have not returned in great numbers to the casinos as they were before the pandemic. But there's also been a huge influx of newer, younger people who've come to gamble, come to experience physical casino floors, and have really embraced it. So we've got a younger mix of people on the casino floor overall. Then when you ask people, how does gaming stack up against other forms of entertainment in terms of, how you see it in terms of innovation or how you see it in terms of value for your entertainment dollar, there hasn't been a ton of movement on this over the past decade or so, but you can see that it is kind of very slowly up and to the right, and that both past year casino visitors and Americans overall think that the industry is pretty innovative. They think that it provides a good or excellent value for their entertainment dollar compared to alternatives. So we have, again, younger people coming to the casinos, younger people gambling, and more people than ever view it as a good or great value for their entertainment dollar. So we're in a good place in terms of participation in gaming here and attracting new people and providing good value to the visitors. I think as gaming has expanded over the past few years, there's been a lot of concern that maybe support for sports betting or support for gaming expansion has waned, and especially in terms of sports betting, that's not the case. Last summer, we asked people, it's been 5 years since the Supreme Court overturned PASPA. Do you think it was right to allow states to decide for themselves whether to legalize sports betting? And overwhelmingly, Americans agree, 85%, so that the Supreme Court made the right decision 5 years on, having seen how it's evolved. And there's been some concern, I think, as sports betting has expanded to almost 40 states now. that familiarity with it may lessen the appetite that people have to expand it into their state. And that is also not the case. You can see support to expand it into your own state where you live has remained pretty high, somewhere between 70 and 80% over the past few years. So support for sports betting expansion hasn't been impacted by a lot of the negative media attention I think we've had around the issue over the past, certainly 2 years. RG is another major factor that comes up in a lot of the media attention that the industry gets. And here we'll start talking a little bit about the difference between the US and the UK. Right, you can see the red line there on the left is the number of Americans who think or agree that the industry is committed to the responsible gaming issue. You can see it's up quite a bit since before, or when PASPA was repealed in 2018. Fewer than 40% of Americans used to think the industry was committed to RG. Now it's in the mid-50s, and it's been steady for the past few years. You can see on the right the big difference between where people here in the US are on a similar question, not exactly the same, so the numbers don't exactly align. But you can see the difference between US consumers and UK consumers when it comes to how well they think the industry or the various verticals in their country prioritize responsible gaming. You can see in the US, almost double, if not more than double, the number of people think that physical casinos in the US are committed and prioritize responsible gaming. Almost 45% here compared to fewer than 20% in the UK. And the same story is true of online sports books. It's not quite as pronounced, but significantly more people here in the US recognize that the industry is committed to prioritizing responsible gaming than they do in the UK. And this is among the general population. Among people who actually engage in these products, the numbers are much higher. It's 80 to 90% among casino patrons or sports bettors who recognize that the industry is committed to doing a good job here. Although when you're talking to policymakers, the general public attitude matters quite a bit. And indeed, like I said at the top, the industry's never been more favorable. There are some people who think, 53%, an all-time high, doesn't sound that great. That means there's 47% who still have an unfavorable view of the industry. And that's true. But despite the huge amount of expansion over the past few years, right, we've gone from just 30% approving of gaming in 2009 to more than 50% approving of gaming today. And look, we're never going to be the manufacturing industry or the consumer electronics industry. We're never going to be at 80 or 90% of Americans who support or have a favorable view of gaming. But I think the trend over the past decade is tremendously impressive, especially when you talk about the expansion that's occurred, the completely new verticals that have emerged across the country over the past few years. Having public support is really key, and I can tell you that in the UK, the public support is not moving in this direction, and obviously that's led to a huge amount of negative policy responses there. One thing I will say, though, when you compare the U.S. public attitudes to policymaker attitudes in D.C., we talked about a lot of different industries, and policymakers are kind of a cynical bunch, and they have a more negative view of every industry we ask about. But the gaming industry has the biggest delta. Right? There's the biggest delta between policymakers and their constituents of any industry we ask about in D.C. So I think this is not a constituent-led risk, or it is a constituent-led risk. But we actually have them on their side. So it is important, I think, when we talk to policymakers to make sure that they recognize, their constituents don't have a terribly negative view of gaming. In fact, they have a pretty positive view of gaming, and it's actually improving. So now, again, I said we talk to policymakers in D.C. We ask them a series of questions every year, and one of them first is about problem gambling. We ask, are you aware of the problem gambling issue? Not necessarily, do you have a negative view, or do you think gambling is an increasing problem? Just, are you aware of it? And you can see last year, awareness on Capitol Hill of the problem gambling increased pretty dramatically. That could be from our work, from our members' work, highlighting the good work the industry does on responsible gambling. It could also be from opponents of gambling. Either way, awareness on Capitol Hill of the problem gambling or the RG issue is up pretty substantially over the past year, see on the right, but on the left, you can see that that's had no impact on their desire or appetite to increase federal regulation on sports betting. 40% of DC policymaker respondents thought that the federal government should be regulating sports betting, would do a better job. 60% thought state and tribal governments should be regulating it. And that's basically unchanged over the past few years that we've asked this. So despite the increased attention on RG, there's been no movement in terms of federal policymaker appetite to increase regulation on sports betting. And so finally, the last and final big issue that comes up all the time around sports betting, especially, is advertising. It gets a ton of press. It's very high profile. And here you can see the number or percentage of Americans. We ask about this every month. It's a big deal. It's a big deal to our members. It's a big deal to the industry. Percent of Americans who think there are too many ads. Sports betting's on the top there. In the mid-30s percentage of Americans. It's a little seasonal. It gets higher in the football season. It abates a bit in the spring and the summer. But about 30%, it's kind of stabilized. 30% of Americans think there's too many sports betting ads. Compares to, mid-20s for casino gaming and lottery more generally. So concern for the number of sports betting ads has stabilized, but it is higher than you see for casino gaming. But when you look more broadly, when you put, outside of gaming, how many people are concerned about fast food ads? How many people are concerned about the number of ads for alcohol? How many people are concerned about the number of ads for pharmaceutical products? Well, sports betting is, it's a little higher. More people think there are too many sports betting ads than think there are too many fast food ads. More people think there are too many sports betting ads than alcohol ads, but not by too much. And you can see fewer people think that there are too many sports betting ads than there are ads for pharmaceutical products. As we'll see on the next slide, it should probably be a bigger delta there. And so, yes, people are concerned about sports betting ads more so than casino ads, but kind of in line with the number of people concerned with fast food ads, with alcohol ads, and fewer than think there are too many ads for pharmaceutical products. And then finally, on the advertising, right, U.S. sports betting advertising units across all channels fell by 4%, almost 4% last year. So consumers across the country were exposed to 4% fewer sports betting ad units than they were in 2001. Sports betting TV advertising units as a share of voice fell 10 basis points, down to 0.4% of all TV spots last year, down from 0.5% in 2002. And Americans, were exposed to more ads for alcohol than they were for sports betting last year. Sports betting's 0.4% share of TV advertising was both lower than alcohol at 0.5 and far lower than pharmaceuticals. You think you're seeing a lot of pharmaceutical ads because you are. Almost 15% of all the ads on TV are pharmaceutical ads. So I'll leave you with, before I turn it over to the next panel, some really hot takes. My hottest take comes on the advertising issue, and I think that Americans reacted kind of negatively to seeing an onslaught of ads with the legalization of sports betting that they had not seen before, that they associated with kind of an illicit market. And I think it's normalizing, and it's going to be seen much more like alcohol, fast food, and hopefully people will recognize that they're seeing a lot more pharmaceutical ads than gaming ads. So with that, I'll wrap up and just say I think what you hear in the media is not reflective of what Americans think about the gaming industry. The U.S., at least today, is not the U.K., and the industry is working very hard to keep it that way. And then finally, I think the advertising issue has plateaued and will continue to abate over the next few years as people grow accustomed to sports betting. So with that, thank you for having me. And I'll give it up.